My own daughter held me underwater until my lungs nearly burst, and when she finally let go, she walked away without looking back. If you have ever loved someone more than your own life, only to watch them treat that life like a bargaining chip, stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you did not happen in a movie. It happened on the dock behind the house I built with my own hands, on a Saturday evening in October, while the sun was still painting the lake gold. My name is Howard Calloway. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon at a hospital in Portland, Oregon. I have held a beating human heart in my hands. I have kept men and women alive through things that should have killed them. I thought that made me unshakable. I thought that a man who had seen that much of death would never be caught off guard by it. I was wrong. Until 72 hours ago, I believed my daughter was the best thing I had ever done. I built this lake house in the Cascades for her. I paid her way through graduate school. I co-signed the business loan that let her husband launch his firm. I invited them up here every summer, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas that Margaret's health allowed. I thought we were a family. I thought the word still meant something. It does not. Or rather, it only means something to the people who choose to honor it. It started with an invitation. My daughter called on a Wednesday, and her voice was warm in a way that I have since learned to recognize as performance. She said Tyler wanted to bring the whole family to the lake house for the long weekend. She said she had been thinking about how much she missed the old days, how she wanted the kids to see where she grew up fishing with her father. She said, "Dad, I really want us to reconnect." I believed her. I drove 3 hours with Margaret, who was recovering from a hip replacement and needed the mountain air anyway, and I felt the particular contentment of a man who thinks he has done something right. On the second evening, Tyler suggested we walk the old dock at sunset. He said he wanted to show the kids how I used to fish from the far end when my daughter was small. My daughter took the kids inside at the last minute, claiming one of them had scraped a knee. It was only Margaret and me and Tyler on that dock. I remember thinking the lake was perfectly still. I remember thinking it looked like hammered pewter in the fading light. I did not feel the push coming. One moment I was pointing at the tree line across the water, telling Tyler about the osprey nest I had watched there for 15 years. The next moment, 2 hands were flat against my back, and the world tilted violently. Margaret screamed. I heard the sound of her falling beside me as I hit the surface, and then the cold swallowed everything. Lake water in October is not water. It is a physical force. It seizes every muscle simultaneously and shuts down rational thought in under 2 seconds. I am a surgeon. I know the physiology of cold shock. Knowing it does not protect you from it. I went under completely disoriented, the impact having driven most of the air from my lungs. I could see nothing. I spun in the black water, trying to find which direction was up, and for a moment I genuinely could not. Then a hand grabbed my collar and shoved me down. Tyler was in the water with us. He had jumped in after pushing us. He was holding me under with both hands, his knees braced against my chest, his face just above the surface. I could see his outline through the dark water, the shape of a man I had called my son for 11 years. My lungs were burning. I clawed at his wrists, tearing skin. But he was younger, and he was prepared, and I was not. I felt my vision beginning to contract at the edges. Then he let go. He let go suddenly, violently, as if startled. I burst upward and broke the surface, gasping so hard I could not make a sound. I had perhaps 3 seconds before I went under again. My body was shaking so badly that my arms barely functioned. I grabbed the dock post nearest to me and hung there, dragging in air. And in those first raw seconds I had exactly one coherent thought. Margaret. She was 6 feet away, clinging to the dock ladder with one arm. Her hip surgery was 6 weeks ago. She should not have been in that water at all. Her face was white, and her lips were already turning blue, but her eyes were open and fixed on the shore, and she was not looking at her son-in-law. She was watching my daughter, who was standing at the end of the dock. My daughter was not jumping in to help. She was not screaming for help. She was standing perfectly still in the orange light with her arms crossed over her chest, watching the water. My throat opened to call her name. Margaret seized my wrist so hard the tendons creaked. She shook her head once. A single violent motion. Her eyes were enormous and terrified and absolutely clear. She had understood something in those 60 seconds that was taking my mind much longer to process. She pressed her finger to her lips. I looked back at my daughter. Tyler had pulled himself up onto the dock and was standing beside her now, dripping, and they were talking quietly, not to us, to each other. He shook his head. She said something I could not hear from the water. I was a heart surgeon. I knew shock. I knew the moment when a patient's body goes into systemic failure, and the mind dissociates from the evidence in front of it. That is what was happening to me. My brain was insisting there was an explanation. My body was holding onto a dock post in 48-degree water in October, and my daughter was watching me drown without raising her voice. The cold was going to kill us faster than they would. I looked at the underside of the dock. I had built this structure myself in 2003. I knew every board of it. There was a gap at the far end where the storage compartment used to be. A crawl space between the dock planks and the old equipment float underneath, big enough for 2 people if they were not proud about it. I had used it as a hiding spot for fishing gear for decades. The kids used to crawl under there to find it. I pointed. Margaret looked. She nodded. We moved through the water without splashing, hand over hand along the dock posts, until we were underneath the structure. There was a shelf of old styrofoam flotation blocks bolted to the underside that kept us out of the water from the chest down. The cold was still brutal, but we were out of sight. Above us, the dock planks let through thin lines of light and the sound of voices. My daughter's voice carried in the still evening air. She said, "I cannot see them. They went under, and I cannot see them." Tyler said, "The current from the inlet runs east under the dock. They are probably already past the point. Nobody finds a body in this lake until spring. You know that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He could swim. He was always a strong swimmer, Tyler." And Tyler said, "Not at 67. Not in October. Not from that far under." I pressed my back against the support beam and stared at the underside of the boards above my head. I had nailed those boards. I had chosen that lumber at a yard in Bend, Oregon, because it was dense and it would resist the moisture. I had spent 2 weekends building this dock so that my family would have a place to fish and watch the sunset. I was listening to my family stand on top of it and decide that I was dead. Margaret found my hand under the water. She held it and said nothing. Above us, my daughter began to cry. The sound was startling because it sounded genuinely distressed, which told me she had been practicing. "They slipped," she was saying. "Oh God, Tyler. They were standing at the edge and they just slipped. I should have been out here. I should have been watching them. The dock is old and the boards are slippery. Oh God." And Tyler, whose hands I could still feel on my collar, said in a quiet, soothing voice, "It was an accident, sweetheart. Nobody is going to blame you. These things happen with elderly people near water. You told him 100 times to put up a railing." Elderly people. That was what I was now. Collateral. A statistic. An accident waiting to happen. My daughter said, "Call 911. Call now. Make sure you sound scared." I heard Tyler's voice change as he dialed. It became cracked and breathless. The voice of a devastated son-in-law reporting a tragedy. My in-laws fell off the dock. They went under and I couldn't reach them. "Please, please send someone." He gave the address of my property, the home I'd paid off in 1998. Margaret put her lips directly against my ear. Her voice was barely a vibration. She said, "Do you know what this is about?" I did. I had known for 3 weeks and had not wanted to believe it. 8 months ago, a development company called Ridgeline Properties had approached me with an offer on this land. The lake house and the 40 acres surrounding it sat on a corridor the company wanted for a resort development. The offer was significant. I had declined it without much thought. I had lived on this land for 30 years. I had no interest in selling. 2 weeks later, my daughter called and said she thought I should reconsider. She said the money would let Margaret and me travel, let us live comfortably without worrying. I told her we were not worrying. She pushed harder than she had pushed about anything in years, and I noticed it, but I did not understand it yet. Then, 10 days ago, a friend from the county assessor's office called me with a question. He asked if I had signed a preliminary option agreement with Ridgeline Properties. I told him I had not. He said there was a document on file with my signature authorizing a surveying access agreement. He read me the date and the notary name. The date was 2 months after my daughter's first call about the sale. Someone had forged my signature. I had not confronted her yet. I had wanted to consult an attorney first. I had wanted to be certain. I had spent 3 weeks being certain. And in those 3 weeks, she had decided it was cleaner to simply remove the obstacle. Hanging under the dock in October water while the paramedics arrived on the shore, I finished understanding what I should have understood before I walked onto that dock. We could not come out yet. The property was surrounded by Tyler's version of events. If we surfaced now, we were two disoriented elderly people with hypothermia claiming a violent crime, and they were the grieving family with a consistent story and a forged legal document that made them look like they had legitimate financial interest in everything we owned. We needed to be dead a little longer. The paramedics searched the surface for 45 minutes. They dragged the nearshore area. They found nothing because we were directly underneath them, pressed against the flotation shelf, breathing through our mouths in shallow pulls to minimize the fog of our breath in the cold air. My hip was locked from the cold. Margaret's surgical wound was in the water. I did not let myself think about what that meant. When the search boats moved east toward the inlet, we moved. I pulled us along the underside of the dock, hand over hand, until we reached the shore beneath the equipment shed, which was built into the bank and had a wooden floor that sat about 8 inches above the water at its low end. We dragged ourselves up and under the shed floor into the crawl space above the waterline. We lay there in the dark, soaking and shaking, on bare earth that smelled like rust and old rope. Margaret was a retired emergency room nurse. She did not panic. She assessed herself, then assessed me. Mild hypothermia, beginning stages, no fractures from the impact. Her wound was wet and would need to be addressed, but not immediately. She pulled an old tarp that had been stored under the shed for years and wrapped it around both of us. We held each other and waited. The property is 40 acres. The equipment shed backs against the main storage building, which connects through a covered breezeway to the house. I had built that breezeway myself. I had also run a water line and an electrical conduit through it. I knew every junction in the wall of this house. I had a specific piece of knowledge that Tyler did not know I had. Behind the utility room there was a second panel access, a space I had framed in when I built the addition in 2009, intending to use it as a wine storage room and never finishing it. It was accessible from outside, through a panel in the breezeway wall that looked like an electrical access cover. It was insulated. It had a single overhead bulb on a pull string connected to the addition circuit. It was large enough to stand up in if you did not mind the framing studs, and it contained, because I am the kind of man who builds things he does not always use, a folding cot, a first aid kit, and 2 emergency blankets left over from a camping trip 20 years ago. It also contained something I had not thought about in years. In 2011, I had run a coaxial cable from the secondary security system in the utility room through the wall to a small monitor in that space, because I had a brief irrational period after a neighbor's property was broken into where I wanted to be able to monitor the house from outside if necessary. The monitor was a 14-inch screen connected to 4 cameras: the kitchen, the living room, the front door, and the back deck. My daughter and her husband did not know this space existed. They had never asked about the breezeway wall. Nobody had. It took us an hour to get there from the equipment shed, moving along the side of the house in the dark, while the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles played across the property. Every time headlights swept toward us, we pressed against the cedar siding and waited. Margaret moved without complaint. I could see in her jaw that the pain from her hip was significant. She did not mention it. Inside the utility space, I pulled the string and the single bulb came on. I opened the first aid kit and cleaned Margaret's wound without speaking. She hissed once between her teeth and then went quiet and let me work. I wrapped it properly with gauze and tape and then wrapped both of us in the emergency blankets, and we sat on the folding cot, and I reached out and turned on the monitor. It took 30 seconds to warm up. Then the screen resolved into the grainy, green-tinted image of my living room. My daughter was sitting in my armchair, the good one, the leather wingback I had owned for 22 years that Margaret always said made me look like a professor. My daughter was sitting in it with her feet curled under her and a glass of red wine in her hand, and she was not crying anymore. Tyler was on the couch with his laptop open, and he was not the wreck of grief he had performed for the paramedics. He was scrolling, quickly, the way you scroll when you are looking for something specific. A third person was in the room. I did not recognize him at first because I was looking at his back. He was standing at the window, looking out at the lake where the search boats were still sweeping the water with spotlights. He was wearing a jacket that was too pressed and too clean for someone who had driven up a mountain road in October. Then he turned slightly and I recognized the profile. Dennis Marsh. Dennis Marsh was the legal counsel for Ridgeline Properties. I had met him once, at a meeting I had attended with my own attorney to discuss the initial offer on the land. He was younger than I expected, late 30s, the kind of man who makes a first impression of competence. I had not thought about him since I declined the offer. I had not known that my daughter had continued the conversation without me. Margaret had not recognized him. She looked at me. I told her in a whisper who he was. I watched her face move through the same sequence mine had just traveled. I turned up the gain on the monitor audio as far as it would go. Dennis was saying, "The search will be called off by morning if there is no surface evidence. With the water temperature and the inlet current, the presumption of drowning is straightforward." He paused and looked at his phone. "The county assessor has a process for death in absentia declaration. Given that both were elderly with documented health issues, the medical examiner will not contest it. Timeline to clear the estate is 6 to 8 weeks. My daughter said, "And the option agreement holds." Dennis said, "The forged option agreement is properly notarized. The notary is not going to examine it again. Once the estate clears, the option converts to a purchase agreement. Ridgeline closes within 30 days of that." He turned fully toward the room, and I saw his face clearly. He was not the neutral legal professional I had met 14 months ago. He was looking at my daughter with an expression that was not professional at all. He said, "You did the hard part." She looked at him and said, "We did." Tyler did not look up from his laptop. I sat back against the framing stud, and Margaret pressed her hand over her mouth, not to muffle a sob. She was too far past sobbing for that. She was pressing her hand to her mouth the way you do when the scale of a thing becomes clear, and you need a moment to keep yourself from saying something that will give you away. I thought about my daughter at 8 years old, teaching herself to fish off this same dock because I worked too many hours, and she was too proud to ask me to slow down. I thought about her at 17, calling me from the hospital in the middle of a shift to tell me she had gotten into college, her voice so high with happiness that I had to step outside the oar to hear her. I thought about the afternoon 2 years ago when she held Margaret's hand all the way through the pre-op consultation and talked her calm when the anesthesiologist's explanation frightened her. I had thought that was love. I had archived it as love. It was an investment in a future claim. I do not know how long I sat with that. Long enough for the search boats to stop moving on the lake. Long enough for my daughter to finish the wine and pour another glass. Long enough for Dennis Marsh to close his laptop and say goodnight and leave through the front door. Long enough for Tyler to stand up and stretch and say to my daughter, "We should get some sleep. There is nothing left to do tonight." And my daughter said, "Look around this place, Tyler. Really look at it. In 2 months, all of this is going to be worth more than my father ever imagined. And none of it is going to sit here rotting anymore just because he wanted to keep it for memories." Tyler looked around my living room, at the bookshelves I had built, at the rugs Margaret had selected over 30 years, at the photograph on the mantle of my daughter and me, on this very dock the summer she was 12. He looked at all of it as a transaction, and he said, "First thing I'm doing is tearing out this kitchen." They went upstairs to my bedroom. I heard the door close. I pulled out my phone. Water damage had killed it in the lake. Margaret's was the same. I looked around the utility space and remembered that I had placed an emergency landline jack in here when I ran the cable, because in 2011, I had also been briefly convinced that cellular infrastructure was unreliable in a mountain emergency. I had never removed it. On the shelf beside the monitor, there was a corded handset still connected to the copper line. I picked it up. There was a dial tone. The Lake House landline had been maintained in the property service package for 20 years, without my ever thinking about it. I called my brother. Carl is 64. He is not a surgeon, and not a federal agent, and not a dramatic man in any particular respect. What Carl is a retired deputy district attorney from Multnomah County who spent 28 years prosecuting financial crimes. He answers his phone at any hour because he has never fully retired from the habit of being needed. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Carl, it's Howard. Don't react to what I'm telling you. Just listen." He said, "Okay." I told him everything. The push, the water, the hiding, the monitor, what I had heard Dennis Marsh say. I told him about the forged signature, about my 3 weeks of quiet investigation, about what I had already sent to my own attorney before driving up this weekend. Carl was silent through all of it. I knew his silence. It was the silence of a man organizing evidence into sequence. When I finished, he said, "You have the forged document." I said, "My attorney in Portland has the original filing and a handwriting comparison I commissioned 3 weeks ago. He also has a wire transfer record showing 2 payments from a Ridgeline subsidiary to a shell company that Dennis Marsh is listed as managing agent for." Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Howard, are you telling me you suspected this before you drove up there this weekend?" I said, "I did not know it would go this far." He said, "But you suspected." I said, "Yes." There was a pause, and then he said, "You drove up there anyway." I said, "She is my daughter." He exhaled. A long, careful breath. Then he said, "Okay, here is what we are going to do. You are going to stay in that wall for 1 more day. I am going to call the county sheriff directly, not local dispatch, and I am going to tell them that there is reason to suspect a staged accident and that the presumed victims may be alive. I am going to recommend they delay the formal search suspension, and I need you to keep that monitor running." I said, "There may not be enough on the audio to prosecute." Carl said, "There is going to be a financial crimes investigator at that property by 8 tomorrow morning, asking to look at the preliminary option agreement. Dennis Marsh is going to be in that room. He is going to be in that room with 2 people he believes have committed murder on his behalf, and he is going to have paperwork that constitutes evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud on top of everything else. What I need is for you and Margaret to stay alive and stay invisible until that meeting happens." I said, "And after the meeting?" Carl said, "After the meeting, you walk in. You let me handle the legal machinery. You just walk in and be alive." I said, "There is one more thing. My daughter mentioned kids earlier. Her children are not here this weekend. They stayed with a neighbor in Portland. Her daughter, my granddaughter, is 6 years old. Her name is Clara." Carl understood without my saying it. He said, "I'll make sure Clara is protected from everything that comes next. You have my word." Margaret had been listening to my side of the call. When I put down the handset, she looked at me for a long time in the dim yellow light. She said, "She really did this." I said, "Yes." She said, "Tyler too." I said, "Tyler too." She reached out and straightened the collar of my shirt the way she has done 10,000 times in 41 years of marriage, a small habitual gesture, and then she left her hand on my shoulder. We did not sleep. We sat on the folding cot and watched the monitor and waited for morning. Around 2 in the morning, my daughter came downstairs and stood alone in the living room for a long time. She walked to the mantel and looked at the photograph of the 2 of us on the dock. She stood there for 3 or 4 minutes. I watched her face on the monitor. I watched to see if there was anything there that resembled the person I remembered. If there was grief, if there was hesitation, if there was any of the 8-year-old girl teaching herself to fish. She took the photograph off the mantel and placed it face down on the shelf. Then she went back to bed. That was when I stopped looking for her in the woman on the screen. At 8:15 the next morning, I heard a car on the gravel drive. Through the audio, I heard Tyler go to the door. A man introduced himself as an investigator with the County Financial Crimes Unit, assigned to review documents related to a property access filing. Tyler's voice changed immediately, tightened in the way voices do when something unexpected arrives, and the prepared story does not cover it. He let the investigator in. Through the living room camera, I watched them sit at my kitchen table. My daughter came downstairs looking polished and composed, the performance ready. Dennis Marsh arrived 12 minutes later, and my daughter's composure fractured slightly at the sight of him. The investigator noticed it. I could tell by the way he let the silence after Marsh walked in run a beat longer than necessary. The investigator asked to see the original option agreement. Marsh produced it from his briefcase. He was smooth, confident, clearly accustomed to these conversations. The investigator said, "This signature was filed with the county assessor's office on March 14th. He paused. "Mr. Calloway's own attorney filed a handwriting analysis with our office yesterday afternoon, indicating that this signature does not match any authenticated sample of Mr. Calloway's signature from the previous decade." He looked up. "Additionally, the notary listed on this document surrendered her commission 6 months ago following an unrelated fraud investigation. She has already provided a statement." The room went very quiet. Marsh said, "That is a significant allegation." The investigator said, "I am also in receipt of a wire transfer record showing 2 payments totaling $48,000 from a subsidiary of Ridgeline Properties to a management account associated with your name, Mr. Marsh, made within 3 weeks of the option filing. He set a printed page on the table. Would you like to explain the nature of those payments? I heard the sound of a chair pushing back. I heard my daughter say, Dennis, stop. I heard Tyler say something too low to catch. The investigator said, I should also inform you that the county sheriff has received information suggesting that the drowning reported last night may warrant further investigation beyond a standard accident report. He paused. I would ask all 3 of you to remain in this house for the time being. I looked at Margaret. She was already standing up. She had smoothed her hair and straightened her clothes, and she looked like herself, which after everything we had been through was the most remarkable thing I had ever seen her do. I said, Are you ready? She said, I have been ready since the dock. I pushed open the access panel. It swung outward into the breezeway, with a wooden scrape that sounded enormous in the morning quiet. I stepped through it, Margaret behind me. My hip was locked and I moved with the stiffness of a man who spent a night on a folding cot after nearly drowning in October. But I moved. We came through the utility room into the kitchen. I do not know what I expected. I know what happened. Tyler saw us first and made a sound I will not try to describe. He knocked over the kitchen chair, scrambling backward from the table, and hit the counter hard enough to rattle the cabinet doors. My daughter turned toward the sound and saw me, and her face went through something I could not name, something that was not quite fear and not quite grief and not quite relief, some combination of all of them moving through her at the same time before she locked her expression down. Dennis Marsh stood up from the table very slowly and said nothing at all. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down in the chair directly across from the investigator. I set my hands flat on the table and I said, My name is Howard Calloway. This is my wife, Margaret. We were pushed off the dock on this property last night by my son-in-law with my daughter's knowledge and assistance. I have been in the breezeway utility space since approximately 9:30 last night, and I have a monitor connected to the living room camera system that recorded conversations in this kitchen and living room from 11:15 last night until approximately 8 this morning. I looked at the investigator and I said, My brother is Carl Calloway, retired deputy DA from Multnomah County. He called your office last night. I believe he told you we might be walking in this morning. The investigator said, He did. I said, Good. I did not look at my daughter while I said any of this. When I finally turned to look at her, she was still standing by the counter, and her arms were crossed, and she had an expression that was trying to be composed and not quite making it. I looked at her for a long time without speaking. She said, Dad. Her voice was almost steady. I said, I am not going to tell you I understand this, because I don't. I am not going to tell you I forgive you, because I don't know yet if that is possible, or what it would even mean. What I am going to tell you is that I watched you take that photograph off the mantel at 2 in the morning and put it face down, and I think some part of you knew what you were doing when you did that. She said nothing. I said, Clara is 6 years old. She needs her parents, or whatever remains of them after this. For her sake, not for yours or mine, you are going to tell this investigator everything about the arrangement with Marsh and Ridgeline. Every payment, every conversation, every document. You are going to do that because it is the only decision you can make right now that Clara will not have to carry for the rest of her life. My daughter's composure came apart then, not the practiced grief from the dock. Something that looked more real. She slid down the cabinet to the kitchen floor and sat there with her hands over her face, and wept in a way that was ugly and unperformed, and told me that somewhere underneath everything else there was still a person I had known. I did not go to her. I wanted to. I am her father, and I will be her father until I die, and that does not stop being true because she tried to kill me. But I stayed in my chair because Margaret needed a doctor, and the investigator needed a statement, and Dennis Marsh was still standing by the table calculating his next move, and I had learned in 32 years of surgery that you have to keep your hands steady, even when your heart is doing something else entirely. Tyler was arrested at the property. Marsh was taken into custody 2 hours later when the district attorney's office confirmed the financial records. My daughter was taken in for questioning and released pending the outcome of the investigation. She called me 4 days later from a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. I have not listened to the message yet. I may eventually. I have not decided. Clara is with Margaret's sister in Eugene, who has 3 children of her own, and a house big enough and a patience large enough to hold one more small person through a complicated season. I spoke to Clara on the phone the day after. She asked when she was coming back home. I told her soon, in the honest way, which means I do not know exactly, but I am working on making it possible. She told me she had been learning to braid her own hair. I told her that was the kind of thing her grandmother would want to teach her properly when she was ready. Carl handled the legal paperwork from Portland. The forged option agreement was voided. Ridgeline Properties withdrew their interest in the land within a week of the arrest, faster than I would have expected, which told me they had known more about the method of acquisition than their lawyers were going to admit in any forum. Carl is pursuing that separately. I kept the property, not because I love it the way I used to. I kept it because I want Clara to have the choice someday, when she is old enough to make it without the shadow of this on top of her. If she wants to sell it then, she can sell it. If she wants to sit on the dock on an October evening and watch the Osprey across the water, she can do that too. It should be her decision, made freely, without anyone calculating its value on her behalf. Margaret and I are staying at her sister's place in Bend while the lake house is cleaned and the locks are changed and the dock gets the railing. Tyler once told me I should have installed years ago. We have had that conversation, she and I, about what comes next. Not in terms of legal proceedings or property management, but in terms of the actual texture of the days ahead. We have talked about the places we always meant to go, and never did, because the hospital needed me, and then the grandchildren needed us, and there was always a reason to stay close. We have talked about the coast, and about a friend who has a boat he has offered to lend us for as long as we want. There is a thing they do not tell you about surviving something like this, which is that you do not feel victorious. You do not feel vindicated exactly. You feel tired in a way that sleep does not fully address. And you feel a quiet around the word family that used to be full of something and is now in the process of being refigured. That takes time. I am not rushing it. What I know is this. I spent 32 years keeping people alive who should have died. I know exactly what it costs to hold someone back from the edge. I know what it looks like when the body fights and when it surrenders. I know the difference between a person who wants to live and a person who has forgotten why. On that dock in October, in the 48-degree water, I remembered why. It was not the land. It was not the property value or the retirement accounts or any of the numbers Dennis Marsh had on his spreadsheet. It was Margaret's hand finding mine under the dock in the dark. It was the sound of Carl's voice on the landline saying, "You just stay alive." It was the image of a 6-year-old girl learning to braid her own hair in someone else's kitchen, waiting for her grandmother to come back and do it properly. That is what was worth fighting for. That is what I crawled through the cold for. If you have ever sat across the table from someone you trusted completely and felt the floor shift beneath you, if you have ever had to make the choice between protecting yourself and protecting the idea of someone you love, then you already understand the hardest part of what I am describing. It is not the water. It is the moment after the water when you have to decide who you are going to be now that the version of your life you were living has ended. I am Howard Calloway. I am 67 years old. I am sitting in my sister-in-law's kitchen in Bend, Oregon, drinking coffee that Margaret made, listening to the sound of my granddaughter practicing braids in the next room. I am not a ghost. I am not a victim. I am a man who built something and nearly lost it and chose to come back for what mattered. Blood is a fact. It does not make a promise. Loyalty is a choice made every day, in small ways and large ones, in the dark when no one is watching, and in the light when everyone is. I spent 67 years confusing the two. I will not make that mistake again. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And, if someone in your life is asking you to look away from something you already know is true, I hope you find the cold clarity that comes from being pushed past the point of pretending. It is not a gift, but it is the truth, and the truth is the only thing that keeps you off the bottom. This is Howard Calloway, and I am still here.